Good evening and welcome back to The Apologists. In tonight's class, we will discuss the Tower of Babel. We will discuss what the Tower of Babel was, what it meant, what happened there. We will discuss how the Tower of Babel was a particular point, at a particular point in the history of man's relationship to God, where man was scattered from God at the Tower of Babel. In these lessons, we intend to show the relationship of Babylon to Jerusalem, the relationship of Babel to Pentecost. We intend to show that it was at the Tower of Babel where the world became the world of sin and shame, and the flesh was loosed without bounds to go about and do whatever it wanted to do. Man, from that tower, divorced God. And in that divorcement, and as a result of that divorcement, man attached himself and made up false gods in an effort to replace the true God from the worship of man. Many of us are not familiar with the real purpose and the real idea of the Tower of Babel, but we will try to share that in these lessons on the Tower of Babel. We'll be studying from Genesis chapter 11. It tells us the story and the history of the Tower of Babel. We also will be studying from Romans chapter 1, verses 19 down through verses number 23, where Paul is actually referring to the Tower of Babel in his discussion of the unsaved world. Let us go now to Genesis chapter 11. In Genesis chapter 11, it reads, "And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelled there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city, and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they began to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and he confounded the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad on the face of the earth. Now, there is Genesis chapter 11, verse 1 down to verse 9, which describes what happened at the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is very, very significant event. It's a very, very significant event in the Bible. Many times we pass over the Tower of Babel because we do not really focus on what really happened there. Many of us have a basic perception of the Tower of Babel as a tower that men tried to build this tower up to heaven, and it was the pride of man that caused them to do it, and God became angry, and God scattered them across the world as a punishment. He confused their tongues. And oftentimes we see this as God's rebuking the wrong kind of pride, or trying to usurp God's power, or trying to go into things that men should not be involved in. And one incident where God rebukes man and punishes him in that isolated incident, thereby scattering them across the world. And so that's pretty much what many times we think about the Tower of Babel. We do not, oftentimes we do not, and I think most theologians have not really stopped and looked at how significant the study of the Tower of Babel is to understanding the entire Bible, especially when it comes to relative to the worship of the true God, and it comes to the ideal of false religion in the world, when it comes to the world of sin and shame. How did the world become dominantly sinful? How is it that the spirit of the world is the prevailing spirit in the world is that of the flesh and of the unsaved nature of man? All throughout history, since the Tower of Babel, wickedness has had the helm of the world's worship and the world's relationship to God, which was pretty much anti-God. From the Tower of Babel came false gods and false religions. The false gods and the false religions, most of them you'll find that came after the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is the origin or the inauguration of the world of sin and shame, false religion, the worship of false gods, and rebellion against God. It is the symbol, it has become the symbol of the false religions of the world and the symbol of anti-godness. The Tower of Babel is the origin of Babylon, which is the symbol of anti-God, false religion, and not only just the anti-God, false religious spirit that's in the world, but the structures of false religion, the systems of false religions, the six systems of anti-godness, all originated or all were inaugurated at the Tower of Babel. The spirit of anti-godness that was at the Tower of Babel, where God stopped them from building a tower up to heaven, or that is to say, to build a tower with a top that would have all manner of false worship in it. All manner of false worship in it. The Tower of Babel was to be a tower that had at the top of it false religions, the zodiac and studying the stars and all of those false religions, things that replace the power of God in our knowledge and our revelation. All of that was to be in the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is the place where man divorced God. God divorced man. Before the Tower of Babel, man was one, and the people were one, and God strove very much to deal with man and try to win him over from the from the book of Genesis chapter 1. Even after the fall, God tried to win man over. And so man was one. And now the reason why the Bible says, and they were one and they spoke in one language, was because there was no Jew and Gentile at the Tower of Babel. There were no Jews and Gentiles at the Tower of Babel. They were all one people, and there was no Jew and Gentile. So man actually rebelled to God as one. He was one man. The Tower of Babel is the start or the origin of all false religions, and it developed into Babylon, which was a nation where it headquartered false religion, and where false religion came from Babylon, and it was the seed or the place of false religion. And so the Tower of Babel, in its complete developed form, or what it developed, became Babylon. And the way it was a picture of how it ended up, or what it became. It became all the false religions of the world and all the false religious systems of the world, whether they be secular or whether they be religious, whether it be the secularism of university studies, or the religions of Buddha or Muhammad or Shinto or Zeus or Baal in the Bible. All of those came from the spirit that was in man at the Tower of Babel, to where they would go out and make up their false gods, of which they infiltrated the world with them. And all of those false gods have the same characteristics, even though there are different ones of them and different kinds of them. But all of them have the same spirit of anti-godness, humanism, Satanism, and all of them have those same characteristics, whether they be in pagan religions or whether they be in what we call Christian religions, Catholicism, or whatever. And this is the reason why many people say that the Roman Catholic Church is Babylon. It is the Babylon because it has so much of the pagan characteristics that are in the pagan religions that all originated from Babylon in them, to where they call the Catholic Church Babylon. And we can discuss that more later. In the book of Revelation, chapter 17, it describes and shows us where Babylon ended up at. And this is all from the Tower of Babel. And it says in Revelation chapter 17, in verse 1, it says, "And there came one of the seven angels, which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore, that setteth upon many waters." That means the great whore. A whore is one that is intimate with something that's foreign. It's not intimate with God, but he's intimate with the devil. And she setteth up on many waters. That means what happened at Babel, that spirit of rebellion, is all over the world, setting upon many waters. "With whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away into the spirit, into the wilderness, and I saw a woman set up on a scarlet colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls. Verse number 5. And up on her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abomination of the earth. The mother of harlots. Babylon, Babel, which is a short for Babylon, is the mother of all false religions. The mother of all false religions. They come out of what happened at the Tower of Babel. Relative to the Tower of Babel and the dispensations, the Tower of Babel occurred in the dispensation of human government. In the dispensation of human government, a dispensation is a time period which God deals with man. In that dispensation, the human government, when men tried to rule by human nature, there was no prophet, no righteous person, no one who was righteous during the time of the Tower of Babel. This time of testing from the flood unto the dispensation of promise, which that particular time period is called the dispensation of human government. During that time period of human government, there was absolutely no heroes of faith. No one who knew God. No one dedicated to God. God tested man in that dispensation to see what man would do without a law. What man would do without God's Spirit. What man would do without God's knowledge. And the Tower of Babel was the results of it. The Tower of Babel was the results of the dispensation of human government, where human beings, unsaved human beings, the unsaved human flesh took over. And when the unsaved human flesh took over, it was an atrocity described for us in Romans chapter 1, where Paul describes this very event. Now, the reason why we say that Paul is describing this here is because Paul is not dealing with what we call sub-units of wickedness or little isolated cases of of man straying away from God in Romans chapter 1, but he's thinking of it in the general sense of how it happened. And the best example that we can have to share is what happened at the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel, man strayed from God as a whole. Man's nature was on display. Man's sinful nature, showing that man needed to be born again, was on display. And it showed out and it showed up. But then God came down and God showed out and God showed up as well. Let us look and see how Paul describes this. It says in Romans chapter 1, we will go to verse number 21. Paul is speaking of the general conditions of the world of sin and shame. The general conditions of the world of sin and shame are all depicted and at the Tower of Babel in the dispensation of human government, where the weakness of the flesh was exposed, where the evil of man was exposed, where man's rebellion against God was exposed, where man's divorcement of God occurred. And he says here in this Romans chapter 1, verse 21, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were they thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible men, and to birds, and to four-footed beasts, and to creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, having the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one towards another. Men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves the recompense of their error, which was meet, which was fit and worthy of that. So when you're studying the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, you can go to Romans chapter 1, verse 19 down through 32, and read Paul's description of the conditions, general conditions of man. This is Paul writing about the general conditions of man because his reference is to the gospel of God, and the gospel of God, which God made his appeal to man. And he's talking here in Romans about the gospel of God and man in relationship to the gospel of God. And he goes back and describes exactly what happened at the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel, in this first lesson, is the place of false religion, the start of false religion, and it being moved across the world. The Tower of Babel is the place of the inauguration of the world of sin and shame, where the world of sin and shame is dominant, where the flesh is dominant, where sin is dominant, where the world has the spirit of sin and the flesh. And that's how the world became the world of sin and shame. And God scattered them across the world. God used the tongue. When he came down, he confused the tongues. And he confused the tongues so that they would not be able to work together to build that tower of anti-godness and go up there and worship those false gods, worship the star and the moon's astrology, and all kinds of demonic things that were up in that particular tower. Up in the top of that tower, some call it the blue part of it, there was most probably going to be the worst kinds of sex sins that you could ever imagine. You think that pornography may be a repeat of this tower by men getting involved in pornography, but there was going to be a pornographic part of that tower where men were going to be with men and women were going to be with women, and it was going to be the most filthy and the most saturated form of false gods and fornication and organs, what do they call them? Orgies or whatever, up there in the top of that tower. And the way man was burning in his lust, it was going to be a horrible thing. They were going to ignore God and try to replace God with the study of the stars and astrology and the moon and all of these false things. They were going to make them gods, unlike God. But God stopped them, and God scattered them across the world. And they had the tongue. God said he confused the tongue. So what was it? It was God giving them the utterance to speak in the confused tongue, where one man could not understand the other man, and one man could not understand the other man. It must have been that each man had his own tongue. And we would begin to compare in another lesson the difference between them speaking in tongues at the Tower of Babel and the tongues at Pentecost. It must have been that each man had his own tongue. Now, these were not the tongues that they developed when they got to the various parts of the world. That was done by man developing languages by using pictures to draw words and to draw letters. And they developed the languages. The developed languages were not the same as these tongues. These tongues were uttered by the judgment of God. They were tongues of utterance. They were almost like in the book of Acts where it says, where the Spirit gave the utterance. God gave the utterance. These are not the tongues that they had when they got to the different parts of the world. No, these were tongues that were used to show how wretched they were, to the point where God had to scatter them across the world. These tongues were a symbol of their wretchedness, and it was actually a symbol of their unsavedness, and a symbol of the how bad the flesh was. That's what these tongues were. They were different from the languages that they developed once they got across the world. When they got across the world, in the different countries, they developed languages many times by pictograms. There's these pictures where they would use pictures in a line to make a sentence, and then later those pictures that they used to make those particular letters were drawn. And they were drawn, and the letters came out looking like what those pictures looked like. And so then they would use sometimes a picture to give a sentence, or a picture to give a word, or a picture that would give a letter. And so that's how they developed languages. Most languages were developed, but these tongues were not that. These were tongues that God gave them to scatter them across the world because of their rebellion. So the Tower of Babel was very, very significant to study. It's very, very significant. When we as theologians and when we as preachers skip over the Tower of Babel, we are lacking a great deal of insight into all of the prophecies and everything pertaining to the world after the Tower of Babel is connected to Babel. And it is extremely important for you, if you want to have a good theological education, for you to have some kind of understanding of what the Tower of Babel was and what it is. In our future lessons, we're going to talk about the Tower of Babel, and then we're going to talk about, compare what happened at the Tower of Babel to what happened at Pentecost. At Pentecost, instead of them being scattered, they were gathered. And they spoke in tongues at Pentecost by the utterance of God. But the tongues at Pentecost meant something different. God bless you and thank you for joining us today as we are teaching on the Tower of Babel. What does it mean? What does it mean? And how is it related to the entire Bible and prophecy? God bless you and thank you for joining us tonight. Yes, this evening we have started in lesson 1 on the Tower of Babel. We will continue this lesson on the Tower of Babel as we will discuss how the Tower of Babel relates to the day of Pentecost. At the Tower of Babel, they spoke in the tongues that God gave them to confuse them so that they would not be able to build this filthy, nasty top of the tower where there would be fornication, astrology, and the worship of Satan, the creation of false gods, and rebellion against God. God stopped them, and he scattered them across the world. That was the day when God scattered man across the world. That was the day of the inauguration where sin would rule in the world through human government from that point on until God makes the change. No, I know some people say, well, sin got in the world in the Garden of Eden. That's correct. We're not trying to say that this is where sin originated, but this is where sin had gained full power over the world because God released and loosed man, gave him up and gave him over. The potential of this was always there since the fall, but it happened at Babel. But God, in the future, from then, at Pentecost, draws man back to himself. And this time he gives man a tongue that is understandable, a tongue that has altogether different meaning than the damnness of the tongue that was spoken at Babel. The tongue that God will give man at Pentecost will be the tongues of the ingathering, the tongues of God calling man back from the fall, the tongues where man can approach God in a different sense in the upper room at Jerusalem, as opposed in the top of a tower of sin and shame and fornication and idolatry and astrology. But it would be an upper room where man would have a relationship with God through the Spirit, and the tongues that God alone would utter at that time are the sign that God is calling man back from the fall. Thank you for joining in with us tonight.